TK, are you on there? Oh wait, that's not me. Anybody got anything random they want to talk about?
Talk about the Cincinnati Bengals.
Cincinnati Bengals?
Yep.
Yeah.
Anyone watch the game?
I did watch the game. I watched the whole thing. Well, sort of. I was installing a new garage door opener. It's a lot harder than it sounds. All right, TK, you should be a co-host now. Oh. Yeah, I can't decide about Joe Burrow. It's like, kind of admire the cockiness out of a young guy, but at the same time, annoying. Anyhow, after that really good transition I made originally to my 10 commandments, I'm just going to go back and start them again. Okay. So there's really more than 10, but that's apparently prescribed by law that you can't do that. The first one is just to know your audience. And I know you've heard this before, but depending on who's going to be reading what you're writing, you're going to change your style. You're going to change the presentation. You're going to change the vocabulary. There's lots of things that need to be altered depending on who's going to read it. And this becomes particularly hard when there are multiple audiences, like the capstone group that I was talking about. Because you have to sort of, at that point, aim for the lowest common denominator. This is somewhere where a lot of policy students, they overestimate, let's just say, the ability of their readers to understand what they're saying. Generally speaking, state legislators, for example, average reading level is 7th grade. Nice. Yeah. So I have a good friend who used to work for the Texas state legislature, and that's what they were always told. Write it like you're giving it to a 7th grader. So it's not like a 3rd grader, but it's certainly not even a college student. And so there are certain vocabulary and things like that that are kind of off limits. And you don't want complicated sentence structure. You want to keep things simple. Related to knowing your audience is knowing why you're writing this thing and really internalizing that. You might be writing a paper for a class just to get a good grade and because they're making you. That's probably sufficient motivation for most people at Carolina, because to get into Carolina, you had to care about your grades at some point in your life. But I always encourage people to think more broadly. Like, why am I really writing this? Hopefully it's because it's something that interests you, that you want to learn more about, that you want to practice your writing. Writing, like anything, is a skill. And it's a skill that can only be learned by doing it. Are some people naturally better writers than other people? Yes. Just like some people are naturally better basketball players or faster runners. But you can still be a pretty damn fast runner if you learn the right techniques and you practice. And, so understanding this kind of broader purpose is useful. And it could be something else. It could be, this is something I'm really interested in. I want to know more about this because I thought about maybe doing a senior thesis. And this might give me some insight into whether this would be a good topic. It could be that it's personal in some way. And you're writing this almost as an advocate because of something that happened to you or somebody in your family. But making it more than just getting an A on the paper is going to help you. Yeah. Here's where we're really getting into policy stuff. Be concise. And you'll see several of the 10 commandments are actually related to this single commandment. That's how important it is. Policymakers and most of the people who are going to be in your audience are very busy people, or at least they think themselves as incredibly busy people. And they don't want to have to sort through a whole bunch of garbage. They just want to read it quickly, be done with it. So you really want to be as concise as you possibly can. Okay, almost to the point of like when you're reading it to yourself, you're like, it almost sounds curt, And there's ways that we can aid this with just the structure. One of the big things that we do is we use headers. Headers are just vital when it comes to policy writing. And there's a couple reasons why. One of the big ones is, again, when you have an audience with limited time or limited attention span, that's probably the better way to put it, they want to just be able to skim it. And they can use headers to skim it. And then they can stop at those sections that are particularly interesting or relevant to them. Now, should they be reading it that way? No. But they're going to. Yeah. And being able to skim something like that and still have an idea of what the overall message is useful. I actually lots of times advise my students to skim the readings before class. You don't have to read the whole thing word for word, but if you skim it and you get an idea as to what's coming up, that actually primes your brain for learning that material. Same thing is true with headers. Okay, what you're doing is you're telling the reader, stop, pause for just a minute, because we're moving on to something else. And you use a descriptive header so that they know exactly what it is that you're moving on to. It primes their brain to be able to take in that very first sentence without any need of an introductory sentence, and then move through and digest it all. So it's not just a shortcut. It's not just a way to get out of writing more things. It serves a very valuable purpose in terms of the overall narrative and how your audience receives what it is that you're writing. So please use headers. For God's sakes, proofread. This means proofreading your own writing. Oftentimes, that means waiting for a while after you wrote it and then coming back and reading it again. Otherwise, you're not going to catch that much. This means having your roommate, right? Your partner, whoever, read it over. The writing center. You really can't have too many people read your writing because they're all going to catch different things. And it is simply a fact, I guess, of just human nature in the way our brains operate, that when somebody who is reading a paper, and especially somebody who is grading a paper, if there are two papers that are substantively identical, but one of them has a bunch of typos and grammatical errors, or is organized weirdly, it is going to get a worse grade. Just period. Now, some of that is because we want you to learn how to write better. Some of it is just that the substance may be in there, but it's harder for the reader to get at it. Okay. The easier you make it for the reader to get at your information, the more it's going to really sink in, and the better the paper overall is going to read. Okay. So it's not just because I'm, a certified member of kind of grammar police that I talk about proofreading. Okay. It's really about the power and clarity of the message. This one is just little, but comes up much more often than I would think at college level. You never use an acronym without spelling it out the first time. It doesn't matter if everybody on the face of the earth knows what that acronym is. You still do it. Okay? It doesn't take that much more time or space. And there's a reason for the sort of tyrannical rule here, which is policy analysts and people writing policy stuff tend to be real subject matter experts. And all the things that we're dealing with, no matter what subject area it is within public policy, there's a lot of acronyms. And we have a tendency to think that if we know what an acronym is, everybody else knows what it is too, or that the audience that we're giving it to is going to know what it is too. Okay? Doesn't matter. Just spell it out, even if it's the freaking FBI. Yeah. Which relates to this idea of not using cliched jargon and avoiding overly emotional language. Remember that what you're trying to do in policy writing is convey information as objectively as you possibly can. Nobody can be completely objective. But everybody can go back through and take out overly emotional language. And you want to do this again because it muddies the message and it may completely turn people off. If it sounds like you're just, this is the worst thing in the world. I'm not saying to write boring. No, kind of am. But I would say 95% of the adverbs out there are unnecessary in policy writing. Okay. This is related to concision. Don't use 10 words when 5 will do. This sometimes can put you in a little bit of a conundrum when you're trying to decide whether to use a fancy word that replaces 5 other words or use those 5 words. Most of the time in policy writing, if it's a word that most people aren't going to know, don't use it. Just like don't use metaphors and things like that people aren't going to understand. But this is something that I think almost anybody, if you take a break from what you've written and you go back and you reread it for the sole purpose of, I'm going to take out some words. I mean, how many of you have done this? You have a paper that has like a hard limit on it. Say it's 2 pages. And you're running like 2 and like 5 sentences. How many of you go back through and you find the paragraph that's last line only has like 1 or 2 words in it? And you go in and you find words that you can take out so that you get that line back. Have you done that? Yeah. So you all have learned the lesson that we are too verbose. And so going back through with that kind of intention, you can eliminate a lot of unnecessary words. Make assertions. Make claims. Make arguments. Just make sure that you have support for them. There's two sides to this. One is you need support. You need some kind of outside source to back you up. The other one is our increasing tendency as a society to just engage in what I call wishy-washy argumentation. You know, where you say, well, it's been argued, blah, 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 blah. Or one might argue, and then you can say whatever the hell you want. No. Right? This is sort of a effect of our current belief in alternate facts and that kind of thing. The bottom line is, when you're making an assertion, you either have support for it or you don't have support for it. Don't have support for it, don't make it. Don't use some qualifier like one might argue. Okay, well, who's arguing that? If it's nobody, don't do it. Right? Don't be afraid to actually make arguments and to do it clearly. Without provisos and that kind of thing. Anticipate counter arguments. No argument or very few arguments are just clear winners. There is going to be another side. There are going to be drawbacks, unintended consequences, all kinds of things that are going to weaken your argument or at least make it a more difficult decision. Well, you need to anticipate it and you need to recognize them. Okay. Otherwise, somebody who is coming back against you can just say, well, you completely ignored this. And then you're just talking about two different things. So you want to anticipate them and you want to counter them when you can. Any questions on this so far? I drink a lot of water when I teach. Sorry. It is water though. I'll come around on LDOC and make sure it's water.
Do we need to find some outside support for our answers in the problem set?
No. So the question was, do you need to find outside support for answers in your problem set? No, because presumably you're getting it from class.
Okay.
If it's from class, that's fine. Here we're really talking about the papers. Yeah. Anybody got a random fact they want to share? My daughter got into Carolina last week.
Congratulations.
I just have to convince her to come here and not go to Massachusetts where her girlfriend is. So if anybody has any help that they can provide in this regard, yes.
My sister followed her boyfriend to college
Uh-huh.
and they broke up before they even got there.
Nice.
She's not there anymore.
Okay. All right. I'll talk to you later on.
I'm a transfer student from Massachusetts, and I haven't met my, card yet.
Oh,
I'm
really?
a semester. Yeah.
All right. Where in Massachusetts?
Boston.
Okay. Yeah, she's gonna get a stigma.
So like, there's a chance to get there and don't meet the person.
Yeah. Well, so normally I would never be like, yes, go follow your high school, romance to college.
Mine's from middle school.
Here's middle school, yeah. No. And I gotta say, I really like this girl. My wife and I I don't know that she could do any better. So. Anyhow.
Oh,
In high school. Yeah. So she's a first year. Her girlfriend is first year, not Holyoke. But yeah. All right. Talk a little bit about organization, and we're going to go through a couple of kind of broad things and then some specific tips, and then I want to talk about the paper assignment for this class, just so that everybody's clear on what is expected, even though it's not due. The first draft isn't due for like a month. One of the things about writing that can make it difficult in terms of teaching and talking to large groups of people about writing is that we all have different writing mechanisms or processes by which we go about doing it. So we could call it a writing style. I think it's probably a process is maybe the better way to do it. The key is that you understand how you write well and how you don't write well. Okay. And again, this just comes through practice. And it comes through going back and reading old stuff that you wrote, which is a super embarrassing thing, right? Anything I've ever read that I wrote a while ago, I'm like, oh my God, I was a moron. But really getting to know how you write best is important. And again, the only way you're going to do that is by writing. Try not to procrastinate. How many people in here would self-identify as a procrastinator? Yeah. Here's the thing about procrastination. With this type of writing, where it involves a lot of research ahead of time, and you never know if that research is actually going to pan out, right? Whether or not it's going to be, say, as big of a problem as you thought it was going to be. You don't want to be changing topics at midnight the night before it's due. You at least want to make sure that you've got enough information there before you engage in your procrastination. What's tough about procrastination is people who are true procrastinators really do better work at the last minute. There's all kinds of evidence and studies that show this. The problem is most people who self-identify as a procrastinator, they're not really a procrastinator. They're just kind of lazy. Or they want to think of themselves as a procrastinator. Or they do a decent enough job when they procrastinate that I feel like it's okay. If you are a true procrastinator, just write it. Just do it. Okay. For most people, though, it is important not to, and especially again when it involves a lot of research. Like if I were doing this paper, I would be doing a lot of research ahead of time. And my problem when I write stuff like this is I do too much research, because that's the part that I like. So one thing that you have to do is learn when to cut yourself off. The only all-nighter I ever pulled in my life, academically related, was the night before my senior thesis was due. And the reason why is because I couldn't stop doing research. I wrote like 140 freaking pages. There's no reason for that. It wasn't even very good. My wife wrote like a 45 page, 50 times better than mine. Anyway, my point is to try not to procrastinate whenever you can. I find it useful, and again, a lot of this has to do with your own writing style. How many of you literally don't know what you're going to write until you start writing? Yeah, I have no idea. It's a way of putting down thoughts. It's a way of thinking for me, just writing. When you are sort of that way, it's best just not to put any limits on what you're writing at the beginning and just start big, just start writing. And then you're going to narrow it down. You're always going to write more than what you actually turn in. And that's okay. It's not a waste of time. It's not a waste of effort. It's part of the process. Plus, sometimes you can find uses for that stuff that you get rid of. What I do when I'm writing a paper is I have my main document file, I call it policy 210 brief. And then I have policy 210 brief dot scraps. And so when I'm going back through and I'm taking stuff out, like I don't want to just delete it because it hurts me. I cut it and I paste it into this other document, right? And emotionally it's helpful, but also there are times where I will go back in and I will grab stuff out of the scrap pile and put it back in the paper. I will take things like ideas and things in the scrap pile and use it for new papers. Yeah. So I think that's a good way of organizing things and letting your brain flow freely without feeling like you're wasting time or effort. That's what I just said. Other people like to outline. That's sort of the opposite approach of sitting down in advance and saying, this is what I need to cover, right? Here is how I'm going to go about it, make a plan, and then execute. That's fantastic. I wish I could do it. So if that's the way your brain works, then that's what you should do. I will say outlining is really good in terms of not procrastinating, because you see how much you really have to do. It also tells you what you're missing in terms of research and things like that. Yeah. So again, it's about knowing your style and then adjusting based on that. All right, a couple of specific tips, and I promise I'm almost done with this. It seems that a lot of people throughout the course of their educational career forget one of the most basic grammatical rules, which is one idea per paragraph. Instead, we write these incredibly long paragraphs that are just all over the place. Right? This is really important in policy writing, to keep it to one idea per paragraph. And this is where headers also help, by the way, keeping everything together in one place. But again, when your reader's going through and there's just one idea per paragraph, well, they can see what that idea is quickly and know whether or not they need to pay more attention. Related to the paragraph thing, by the way, not this. If you like to use semicolons, just make sure you do it correctly. Okay, there has to be a verb after the semicolon. It has to be a complete sentence. All right. Except in recommendation section, avoid first person. In the recommendation section, by all means do it. This is where, as the analyst, you're going to be sort of owning up to the assumptions that you made, to the priorities that you placed on different criteria, all of those things. And then it's fine to say, I decided that I wanted to make sure that something got done. And so I'm focused more on political feasibility than I am on effectiveness. Before that point in time, just don't do it. Also, avoid phrases like these. Right? It should be noted that. Or an important point is, well, no shit. It wasn't important. Why are you telling me? This is also a good way to reduce the number of words in your writing, is getting rid of these qualifier phrases, these things that we use when we're uncertain. Make sure you use complete sentences. This is true even for 7th grade readers. Avoid redundancy. This is one of those things, there is going to be a certain amount of redundancy present when it comes to, say, your recommendation section. Right? You're going to want to repeat why the alternative that you're recommending is superior. So a certain amount of redundancy is a good argumentative tool. But you don't want to use the same sentence in multiple places. You don't want to talk about the same idea in multiple places. So again, it's a way of cutting things back and being more concise. This one is an absolute for this class. Use the Oxford comma. I know. Technically, it can go either way. Right? But especially if I'm your grader, I'll let the other graders decide. If I'm your grader and I don't see the Oxford comma, everybody knows what the Oxford comma is, right? Right? It literally, it hurts me. It's like somebody is jabbing my heart every time it happens. Yeah. So remember, we're talking about writing that needs to be concise and needs to be clear. The whole point of the Oxford comma is that it is clarifying so that you don't get something like this. Now, personally, I think an Obama-Castro marriage would be fantastic. But it's just, we're not counting the number of spaces, right? The whole reason that the Oxford comma is no longer required is because journalists demanded that they not have to put it in so that they could save space. That's it. Period. End of story. So you're not worried about that in this class or in this type of writing. So use it. And again, proofread. I really can't say that one enough. See, I'm being redundant because it's important. All right, want to go through some resources that I think will be useful for you just on writing, but then in terms of finding sources for your papers and that kind of thing. I always encourage people to use the Writing Center. That's a good sort of anonymous proofreader, if nothing else. So take advantage there. They do send me an email whenever somebody goes to them, so I know when you go. Never a bad thing. There are a couple of books out there that I think are useful. Catherine Smith wrote a book on writing, it's called Writing Public Policy. You can find it in the library. There used to be a companion site online But when I checked the website this morning, it didn't work, so I took it off. But I do think that I saw some hacked PDF versions online, so you can check that out and see. But it's actually can be really useful. It goes through different types, like the memo and the one pager. It talks about how to do it. Faye, any of y'all, have you ever looked at that book? No, okay. In the course of doing this stuff, I found a syllabus from a class at UT Austin that's called Writing for Policy. And it has a lot of good stuff on there. I actually went through and read several of them this morning. But so I just decided to include the link for fun. Strunk and White is always good. Anybody who's doing any writing ought to have some Strunk and White laying about. And anybody who's really interested in the process of writing, whether it's trying to learn what your own process is, whether you're just sort of interested in writing generally, or whether you just like Stephen King, his book on writing is phenomenal. And you know, it was, I found it very helpful actually when I was doing my dissertation. So I always like to recommend that particular book, and it's Stephen King, so interesting. Okay, let's talk about sources. Obviously, there are good sources and bad sources. It can help you figure out which is which, though you surely have some idea already. Whenever it is possible, I encourage you to use data from the original source. This isn't as hard as it sounds. Let's say you're reading a New York Times article and they're talking about a new study that shows, you know, X. Well, if it's a decent journalistic publication like the New York Times, they should have a link to that study. And you should be able to click on that link, see that data, and then you can directly cite the study, not the New York Times article. Very simple. I think news articles are a good source at times. Sort of like Wikipedia, they can be a good source of sources. They are good sources of things like political feasibility. You know, like, well, I don't know, what did Manchin say about this? So you can use them, you know, for that. But I do expect to see a majority of your sources being academic, think tank, or government reports. I'm not going to give you a number. I'm not going to say you have to have this amount of sources. I had a student recently who only used 3 sources and then got mad when she didn't get a good grade. And she said, well, you never told us how many sources. And I said, I shouldn't have to. 3 sources is clearly insufficient. So use your judgment. I would say at least 8. I would say most papers that I see that are A's are probably 12 to 15. Did you see that's about right, TK? At least, yeah. The UNC library has all kinds of databases and search engines and this kind of stuff that you can use. Personally, I've never found any of them superior to Google Scholar. So I just use Google Scholar. It has some built-in things that you can sort of test the validity of the source by seeing how many times it was cited by other people, right? You can click on that number of citations and actually see the articles in which it was cited. Chances are pretty good that they're going to be useful if the original article was useful. You know, and You can link Google Scholar to UNC libraries so that you have access to their journals. That's true even if you're not on campus. I also like that if UNC library doesn't have it because of budget cuts, there's a see all versions thing. Y'all aware of that? Like on the far right, on the bottom, it'll say, see all 10 versions or something. And sometimes one of those versions is like a PDF that somebody posted. Yeah. Take a minute, let my brain catch up. All right. Yes.
I've been creating a research document, my time here at UNC, and I can send that out to y'all, email that to the class for y'all to use.
Sure.
I just ask that y'all give me whatever other resources that y'all find so that I can also add that onto the document.
Okay.
It's just a huge document full of different links to articles, scholarly articles, think tank stuff.
That'd be great.
If you want me to just give that to TK to put out on like announcements or something.
That's fine. Yeah. I'll show you some other stuff that's sort of related too. So Google Scholar is great. One source that's different in policy writing is the numerous think tanks that are out there. And think tanks, it's useful for sources for your paper, but it's also useful in terms of reading policy analysis, reading different types of policy writing on subjects that are interesting to you. So I give you direct links to some of the major think tanks, the ones that I think are particularly good in terms of the research that they produce. Just like everything in life, there are leanings, political leanings involved in these things. If you want to know what they are, Rand I would classify as sort of libertarian. Brookings is more liberal. Cato is more conservative. Pew is more liberal. AEI is sort of libertarian conservative, you think? Yeah. Kaiser Family Foundation, which if you're doing health policy is just wonderful, a little bit liberal leaning. I say this only in that people will use those as arguments against these sources. I've seen nothing from these sources in recent years indicate that their actual research is in any way biased. Right? It's the values, the ideology drive what they research. But the actual research is fantastic. I have a student that's been working at AEI now. She was a ULA in this classroom for this class just a few years ago. She got a job at American Enterprise Institute right out of college as a policy analyst. This I want to show you is something that there's a librarian in Davis who is sort of the public policy librarian. And he and another woman created a site for our capstone course. Stop that. That I link for you here. And it's got a lot of interesting stuff on here. Okay, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but it has sort of relevant sources of data. It's got these different search engines that you can do. He links I forgot to mention the Google think tank search engine. There's a link to that on my PowerPoint. I highly recommend that you use. If you don't happen to have the PowerPoint handy, if you just write Google think tank in the regular search bar, it should be the first thing that pops up. One thing I'll show you that I think is really neat in the sources is this policy map. So it starts off with the US. You can zoom out, but it's mostly US stuff. You can zoom in to different states, but it's got all these variables up here, right, that you can use. And say I'm interested in, you know, income, and I'm looking at household income, median household income. Remember, we use median for income. I just have to hit that, and look, it populates the entire map. And you can do it, and you can say, okay, this is county level, 2010. Maybe I want congressional district. Maybe I want whatever, metro division. Sometimes you can do city, sometimes you can do census tract. You know, it just depends on the variable. But what they've done is they've gone out and they've aggregated a lot of large public data sets into this one tool. And so you can see the map, you can see the data behind the map. But I didn't feel like our capstone students should have sole access to this, so I stole it. Yeah, and here's the link for the Google Think Tank search engine that is very useful. Any questions on sources? One thing about sources is related is the bibliography and citations. I highly recommend that everybody just choose a reference manager and stick with it. It doesn't really matter which one you choose, I don't think. But having one that can sort of follow you throughout your college career is really helpful. Because you can go back and find sources that you found for a different paper, you know, and it also helps just in terms of getting citation formats right, producing bibliographies, all of that. I happen to use Zotero for whatever that is worth. I find it useful because it'll save PDFs, it'll save JPEGs. There's a cool little extension that you can stick in your browser that will save it directly from the browser. The other thing that you can do is within Google Scholar is you can, in your settings, put whatever reference manager it is that you're using, and you can import the citation directly from the Google Scholar page into your reference manager. That's pretty cool. Do you remember that we use APA style in public policy? So that means in-text parenthetical citations. That means you cannot do a single citation at the end of a paragraph for all the sentences preceding. You have to do every sentence. It is annoying, but that's the rule. The Carolina site is pretty good. I felt like I can't be totally disloyal and put it on the PowerPoint, but I will tell you that the best website for these is from Purdue, the Purdue OWL. So you can just Google that. But it is unfortunately clearly superior to our all right. So what I have up here now is just the paper template for this course. And so I thought I would just go through it really quickly, so that you know what it is that you're going to be turning in and what it is to expect coming up. The first draft is due, I believe, March 6th. And the first draft goes from the introduction to the role for government. So the first 4 sections. The paper itself, we say, is roughly 12 pages. Okay, that is not a hard maximum nor minimum. It is, generally speaking, what it takes to write a good paper in this class. You certainly can write fewer than 12 pages. You can probably write 13 pages. You might even be able to go to 14 if you're really nice to your grader. Anything beyond that, you might get some eye rolls and other things. But these sort of pages that I have on here, these are just ranges. Okay, these aren't any kind of requirements. This is generally what we've seen it takes to do a good job. Obviously, the introduction really should only be a paragraph. And it's an introduction. Okay, you're not getting into the data of your problem definition or any of that in here. It's for providing historical context and that kind of thing. And remember that the introduction ideally should always be written last. I happen to, the way I do it is I write an introduction at the very beginning, right? But my introduction, the first one that I write, is usually like a page and a half long, and it's full of all kinds of crazy stuff. And then I get into the other things, and then I go back and I essentially scrap that entire introduction, and I rewrite it. Because I don't know what I'm gonna write until I've written it. And your introduction should capture what you actually wrote. Yeah. Then the problem definition, I've seen some as few as 2 pages. Most of the time you're talking 3 or 4 pages to do an adequate job. This is where you're really writing using data. Right? You're using data and you're writing about data. You're explaining the data. Showing the existence of a problem, the size, the scope, the distributional effects, all of those types of things. Again, you can use pictures like maps, graphs. I don't recommend using tables. They do not go against your page count in any way. But the main thing is really to make sure that you're specific about why it is a problem and that you are using numbers, something quantifiable, to show why it is a problem. That requires that you have sources to back up those numbers. You also talk about stakeholders, right? Who's being affected by it? That part kind of comes naturally, but you also want to consider who will be affected by any policy change. The goal section is something you won't typically see in a policy analysis. This should literally be a 1 or 2 sentence affair. And it's about the goal of the policy brief itself, right? This paper will explore alternative, solutions to, greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. Something like that. I have you do this because where people tend to go wrong with this paper is between the problem definition and the alternatives. That there's some disconnect, and the alternatives aren't really going at the problem as it was described up above. And so what I have kind of discovered is if I can have people write this down in a sentence or 2, what the goal is, it maintains the focus and it stops the ooh, squirrel activity. Yeah. So that's the goal section. The last one, and I haven't looked so carefully at the syllabus to know off the top of my head right now. The role for government may or may not be included in the first draft, depending on where we're at. What I want you to know about the role for government is we are focused on economic justifications. There can be ethical justifications, moral justifications, or whatever, but I want there to be economic justifications as well. One of the things that this class hopefully is teaching you to do is take ethical arguments and reframe them in a way that isn't diminishing the argument, it's supplementing, adding to your sort of arsenal. Yeah. So you're going to be talking about market failures. If you're talking about like prisons or public schools, look, the role for government there is clear. They're the only ones that can do anything about it because it's their actions that are causing the problems. Right? In that situation, again, this should be a very, very short section. Then you move on. The heart of the paper is the criteria and alternatives. And I just really want to emphasize to please follow this. You know, it seems like no matter how many times I tell classes, there's a template there, follow it. People don't identify the criteria at the beginning of this section. They don't briefly describe what the alternatives are. And that's important organizationally. Okay. So you should have, you know, a little paragraph that says, I'm going to examine, or this paper will examine, work one of my commandments, you know, the following three alternatives, you know, a carbon tax, a cap and trade program, and something else. And then you say the criteria by which these alternatives will be evaluated are the following: cost, effectiveness, political feasibility. And then you have a header that says carbon tax. And then you go and you actually apply those criteria to the carbon tax. Right? And you explain how a carbon tax works, what the mechanism is. So you do that for each of your three alternatives. In general, and again, different readers have different preferences here. So if your grader tells you something different, totally fine. Listen to them. They're the one putting the grade on there. Yeah. I think the strongest argumentative organizational tool is to go from essentially your weakest to your strongest alternatives. So you want whatever you're going to end up recommending to be the last one that you discuss. The reason for that is when I'm reading that last one, I'm able to, even without your help, compare it to the prior two. And it should be clear to me as I'm reading it, well, this is clearly the right one. And then I get to your recommendation section and you say, yeah, you should do that one. And I'm like, well, duh. That makes the reader feel smart and feel good about themselves, right? And that's a good thing. The other option is to go strong early and put your best one first. But whatever you do, don't put it second. All right, any questions on this? No? Yes.
I guess not a question, but just like a confirmation, because I know with policy 101, we had like an executive summary at the top of ours, we don't do that for this one.
No, you do not need an executive summary. And even though we're doing APA format, you don't need an abstract. You don't even need a title page. So that part of it you can ignore.
Thanks.
So would you like a heading for criteria and alternatives and then a heading for each alternative?
Yes. Yeah, and you don't, generally speaking, let's say you have carbon tax, right? You don't then want to put like cost and then talk about cost and then effectiveness. Like that's too much. Um, From my perspective, you don't need that many like subheaders. All right, well, I'm very excited that we're actually like in each other's presence. And we will be back here on Thursday. And somebody remind me to start the Zoom at the beginning. Yeah. All right, have a great afternoon.
Yeah.